Good afternoon. My name's Harry Kazianis. I'm the managing editor of The National Interest. I'm pleased to be here today with Robert Haddick. Robert has a great new book out there we're going to talk about today. It's called Fire on the Water. The book basically sort of talks about Chinese strategy in the Asia Pacific, things like anti-access area denial, which is a very hot topic on the National Interest website, Chinese military doctrine, what they could presumably do with all of that stuff, so to speak, and U.S. grand strategy and U.S. military doctrine, the pivot, sort of, what does the United States do when we sort of think about these different approaches to China? So Robert, I want to start by asking you sort of your motivations for the book. There's a lot of different articles, peer-reviewed stuff, a lot of books that tackle this subject. What was your motivation for writing this?
Well, Harry, thanks for having me here. I started on this project initially when I was hired by U.S. Special Operations Command, Joint Special Operations University down in Tampa, Florida, to do a research paper monograph for them on the role of coalition special operations forces in the East Asian security competition. And so I worked on that project, and it was sort of a narrow technical project. And after working on that, I realized that the subject of China's military modernization and the security competition in East Asia needed a much broader, wider treatment than I was able to do with that paper. I also noticed that I had a lot of thoughts about this subject that I wasn't reading elsewhere, that other scholars weren't touching on, so I felt that I needed to complete my thoughts on it by doing this book.
Excellent, excellent. So maybe it'd be a good idea, Robert, walk us through a little bit sort of what's happening in the Asia Pacific. There's a lot of talk about anti-access area denial or A2AD, AirSea battle. If you could, the book talks about this a little bit, so I think it'd be good for our people on the internet to sort of understand this. So walk us through a little bit. What is Chinese anti-access area denial and why is it important?
Well, China is re-emerging now as a global power, returning to a great power status that it had hundreds of years ago. And as it does so, it realizes that it has a whole world full of interests that it needs to protect, just like all great powers have throughout history. And one of China's, in their sense of their history, one of the great vulnerabilities they've had was the vulnerability from their maritime approaches. This is how the Europeans came in to China in the 19th century and caused so much trouble in the memory of Chinese culture. And so China has a natural inclination now to try to reestablish its control over its maritime approaches to prevent anything like that from happening again to them. And so that's their motivation for building up their naval power, their land-based anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile power, and so forth.
Excellent, okay. And the actual strategy, as I understand it, it's basically to deter a much more modern power that's much more force, like the United States, to come into a conflict area. Would that be an accurate assessment of that?
Well, the Chinese, yes, that's true. The Chinese military modernization program has been going on for 2 decades now. It's very well designed, very smart, and it is specifically targeting or taking advantage of particular vulnerabilities and problems with the design of U.S. forces and strategy in the theater. And ever since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, and after China saw the effectiveness of the missile and sensor revolution in the 1991 Persian Gulf War, they realized that this is a path that they could go down to establish control over their maritime approaches in the future. Yes. And they've been working on it for 2 decades now, and it continues to go on.
Yes, it's quite amazing. So something I found very interesting in the book that you talk a little bit about is you talk about the air-sea battle concept, offshore control. We've talked a lot about these things in the national interest. But one of the things I find fascinating that really differentiates your book from a lot of other scholars that are out there is that you praise and critique both of these things in different ways. So maybe if you could walk us through a little bit about what air-sea battle is and some of the pluses and minuses, but also offshore control, some of the pluses and minuses.
Right. Well, I've kind of a nuanced argument on these 2 points here. My larger point, and I'll answer your question. My larger point is that the U.S. and its allies and partners in the region are going to need a very broad portfolio of tools, a whole large toolbox of various tools in order to manage this peacetime security competition in the region there. And offshore control, the elements of offshore control, distant blockade and so forth, need to be a tool in the toolbox. Some of the aspects of AirSea battle need to be in the toolbox. But my critique of these is that standing by themselves, they can't be the full solution to the problem that the U.S. has in the region there with the military competition with China. Now, to answer your question, the problem with AirSea battle, as it's currently contemplated, and in the Schwartz-Greenert paper that came out in the American Interest a year and a half ago, the general problem, as those 2 4-star officers described it, was that they're basically going to expend precious U.S. military resources against China's competitive strengths rather than China's vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And this is not a competitive strategy because with China, with its continental position and its cost advantages, will always be able to keep ahead of a cost competition like that. So that's sort of a summary critique of my critique of AirSea battle. Now on offshore control, once again, I think the biggest problem with offshore control is a political problem. It would basically be the United States declaring war on the global economy as the U.S. would hypothetically impose a blockade on the Chinese economy with a naval blockade out at some distance from China. But it's not the 19th century anymore. It's not a colonial era that we live in. There would be many dozens, hundreds of countries in the world that who are non-combatants, non-belligerents in a hypothetical conflict between the U.S. and its allies and China, and we would be turning them into enemies. It would be a politically unsustainable strategy because of the harm that it would do to all these non-belligerents around the world.
No, it makes a lot of sense. One of the things I don't think that's talked enough about when we talk about sort of Chinese strategy, the growth of all these, this missile-centric sort of A2AD, is sort of the Russian aspect to it. Looking through the research, looking through your book, it's very clear that a lot of these different systems are built on Russian technology.
Right.
So maybe talk a little bit about that. Maybe somehow the foundations of Chinese anti-access and Chinese military technology sort of have a Russian source.
Yes, that's very true. And the principal components of China's major threats to U.S. expeditionary forces in the Western Pacific are just a couple of Russian weapon systems imports, which the Chinese acquired a long time ago, and now they licensed domestic production in China, and then now they're producing for themselves outside of the licenses. But anyway, a few of them are first the Su-27 flanker aircraft, which has been a highly successful fighter bomber for both the Russians and the Chinese. Now the Chinese produce it in their own version called the J-11B, which showed up a few weeks ago in this incident over the South China Sea with the Poseidon P-8 Navy aircraft. The Chinese now produce that for themselves. They're going to have over 400 Su-27 flanker variants of various kinds by the year 2020. Many of them can be armed with long-range supersonic anti-ship missiles, which are going to present a great range problem for U.S. forces and for ship and fleet defenses for the U.S. Navy. The whole range of Chinese anti-ship and land attack cruise missiles can trace their origins back to Russian designs, which the Chinese now have modified and with their own engineering are making great improvements on. The Chinese submarine force The Kilo-class submarines are excellent, very quiet, very stealthy, diesel-electric submarines. They're armed with supersonic anti-ship missiles, the Sizzler, and so that's another example of Russian technology that the Chinese have adapted to their anti-access strategy.
Oh, that's excellent. I think a lot of people forget about some of these Russian origins. So I sort of have a bigger question. The book is sort of divided between sort of how we got here in sort of the strategic situation in the Pacific and sort of the path that you see us sort of maybe taking forward. So without giving any major spoilers on your book, maybe walk us through a little bit sort of some of your key recommendations of what strategy the United States should take sort of knowing all this. But also I would want you to sort of frame your answer in the respect that the United States has a lot of challenges. I mean, right now we're dealing with a crisis with the Islamic State, we're dealing with a crisis in Ukraine that may or may not be over, we're not really sure. So in terms of really any strategy the United States would sort of put into the Pacific, how do we keep the focus there?
Well, the U.S. national security staff in this country is very large, and it's much larger than it was when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger had to deal with a similarly broad portfolio of problems back in the 1960s and 70s. So hundreds and hundreds of people work at the National Security Council. Thousands of people work at the Pentagon on strategy, budgeting, planning, and so forth. We have these huge staffs at the Regional Combatant Command, Pacific Command in Honolulu, and so forth. So I find the idea that there's not enough staffing power to manage all the different problems that the U.S. government has to face around the world, not a good explanation. So I think there's enough brain power to go around to address these problems.
Excellent, excellent. Well, with that, I think we're going to leave it there. We've been speaking with Robert Haddick, one of my favorite Asia and military security experts, author of the new book, Fire on the Water. I suggest you check it out. My name is Harry Kazianos. You have a great day.